Welcome to a discussion on globalization and the changing dynamics of social movements. Both as a student and common person, we do understand that we live in an era of globalization since late 1980s. This era is widely facilitated by phenomenal expansion of information and communication technologies and the emergence of information society, which is also termed as knowledge society. This emergence has widely affected the way we think, the way we do the activities, organizing our social activities, forming of our solidarities across the space. This alteration has widely affected the social movement culture, the way social movements are organized, manifested and interlinked all over the globe. As against this backdrop, we will be having a discussion on globalization and the changing dynamics of social movement. In doing so, what we will be doing? First, we will be contextualizing social movement within the whole dynamics of society. Then we will be conceptualizing social movement. We will be delineating the vital elements of social movement. Then we will go further, talk about the origins, perspectives of social movement. Then we will talk about the intersectionality between globalization and social movement and transformation and social movement both in the globalized world and in the pre-globalized world. We also will be talking about the varieties of manifestation of social movement and social anti-movement within this globalized world. Then we will be concluding with the formulation of a social movement society. Let us begin with how do we contextualize social movement. When you contextualize social movement, usually it is thought of social movements are the exceptional episodes, exceptional phenomena in the society. But as a student, we will have to accept that social movements are not exceptional phenomena. They are the part of the society, part of the social progression, part of social development. But these are different from the regular process of social progression and social development. How these are different, as Alain Touraine talked about, these are different in that way that it talks about the varieties of anomalies that exist in the societies. Somebody, some force, some solidarity, some group should come forward to delineate, talk about the social anomalies, talk about the social injustice. That's why what Alain Touraine talks about, social movement are the burning fires in the society. It talks about the social anomalies, social injustice, and simultaneously depicts and suggests the ways and means for rectifying those social anomalies. What Melusi widely talks about, that they are the prophet of the present. They live in the present society. They also forecast that what kind of society, an ideal society, can be built up. So in that way, both as a burning fire and as a social prophet, social movement talks about formation of an ideal society. Social movement not only talks about the formation of ideal society, it also creates a democratic space giving everybody a sense of equality, fraternity and justice, and through that people can create a space for their existence within the democratic arrangement of the society. By doing so, social movement creates a kind of a new pace within the social order. That new space is full of new ideas, full of new journey, a process of rejuvenation in the society. So when we are talking about these are the location of social movement within the social society, let us talk a little bit about what do we understand by social movement. Social movement, though they live in the society, there are social phenomena, but they are different from the rest of the other social phenomena. Because there is a tendency to talk about any kind of collective mobilization, any kind of collective episodes to be social movement. No, there is certain kind of phenomenon to be accepted to recognize some kind of episodes to be social movement. What are those? Social movement are the first organized and collective efforts. These are organized and collective. That's why they are not like a sporadic, a kind of a spontaneous reflection of a one-time phenomenon. This is a collective, well thought about, organized effort first to bring about change in the social thought, beliefs, values, attitude, relationship, and the major institution of the society. Or they may be organized and collective efforts to resist those changes and change in those whatsoever talked about in the thoughts, beliefs, values, attitude, relationship, and major institution in the society. So it's having two components. On the one hand, social movement can rejuvenate the change, facilitate the change, or social movement may also be organized to resist those changes. So we are to look into what way those collective organizations, those collective organized activities are taking place or has taken place in the society. At this stage, let us talk about some of the key elements, some crucial or the vital elements of social movement. As I told, the social movement ought to be organized activities. First, we have to recognize that there should be an organization. Until unless there is an organization, social movement can't be sustaining. So it is through the organization, the social movement come together, because it is through the organization that produces another kind of element, what we call a leadership. A leadership is important. Until unless there is leadership, there will be no people to mobilize the people, to articulate the interest and to convey the message of that organization. So there is a difference between the masses and the messengers. So the leadership are the messengers. They give the message of the organization. Organization is an abstraction, but the reality, leaderships are the realities, those which are visible. Third important component is that ideology. It is the ideology that gives legitimacy of any collective action, legitimacy of organizing, legitimacy of asking for change, or legitimacy for resisting the change. The third important component is an ideology. Ideology is a worldview, a collective way to look into the world. It's a kind of perception. The fourth important component is the interest articulation. Interest, there may be several people having varieties of other interests, but those interests are to be threaded together, are to be put together in an organized way. So what do you call about, in every movement there is a demand, there is a charter of demand, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these are the demands. So these are the change they want. This is the new thing the social movement look for. What are those new things? What are those changes? What are the change in those institutions? So this specific interest articulation of the people are another important component of social movement. So these are usually done by the leadership in negotiation with the people. When people comes to a social movement, they become part of collective mobilization. Until unless there is collective mobilization, that is the life force of a social movement. A social movement can't be a social movement. So life force of the social movement is always a collective movement, the visibility of the movement. Leaderships are there, leaders are there in one place, but the leadership will not be able to get mass of a meaning until unless there is collective mobilization. Okay, so in this collective, through this collective mobilization, it comes to the sixth point, that is developing linkages. Social movement develop linkages with varieties of the other movement, varieties of the people, because several people will be having several kind of interests, several kind of grouping. Social movement, they develop the linkages and alliances with varieties of the social groups and varieties of the other formation in the society. By doing so, it develops a kind of a community of followers and participants and sympathizers. So social movement will have a concrete followers. They are the concrete followers. They will be having concrete participants. They will participate in the movement. Then also social movement will have a kind of sympathizers. Sympathizers, they may or may not participate, but they may be the sympathizers of social movement. By doing so, social movement also create another community of the opponents. So social movement is as much the followers, as much the participant, as much the sympathizers and the adherent. Simultaneously, they also create a community of the opponents against which the social movement is directed. That may be the state, that may be the employer, that may be the other forces. So a kind of a thing which we call developing a community of followers and participants and sympathizers, similarly an identified category of the opponents of social movement. Then when these are already there, but social movement is also characterized by sustainability. A social movement should have the character of sustainability. It should not be only one point phenomenon. That may not be a movement. If it is only one point phenomenon, people are organized under the leadership of some people, so that may evaporate the second day. If it does not continue, it's not having that sustainability, it may not be a social movement. So what is important? Social movement should have an element of sustainability. Then the ninth phenomenon is that identity formation. Because by creating a community of followers, the participants, the adherents and sympathizers, they create an identity, a kind of a solidarity. That through that solidarity is movement is known. So that solidarity is the identity of a social movement. That identity is linked to the ideology, identity is linked to the leadership, linked to the organization, linked to the interest articulation, linked to collective mobilization. So what is important? Social movement also will create identity. Last but not least, that every social movement should have a life history. It's a social movement of the living thing. I mean, one social movement is continuing over a period of time. In the process of its continuity, it may reject many of the earlier elements. It may also incorporate many of those elements. In the process of incorporation, it may have new organization, because there may be certain new leaderships are coming, a new leadership. It may have some ideological modification. It may have new interest articulation. So what is happening in the process of progression of social movement acquires a life history. That life history denotes the whole trajectory of change of social movement. When we are talking about all those criteria of vital elements of social movement, we will have to recognize another fact, that social movement is also having the specific origin, and also since it is having it is evolving within the society, it is having certain origin. Origin means we are talking about the causes of manifestation of social movement. What are the reason? What are the origin? How it has emerged? Why it emerged in the society? There are 4-5 mega perspective widely talk about the social movement originates because of the following thing. One important dimension widely talked about, the structural strain in the society. What are the structural strains? Those may be new cultural parameters, or new technological innovation has taken place in the society. Those have put lot of strain on the society. That strain is looking for a new kind of a change. That is new kind of a change, societal arrangement to be brought in. So people feel like that is old kind of arrangement, the cultural arrangement and the technological arrangement, those don't need some modification. So people may organize themselves for a social movement. The second is that status inconsistency. There may be status inconsistency in the society. Those inconsistency in the form of economic, cultural and political. That is, somebody may be economically well off, the upper class and the lower class. The cultural inconsistency. Somebody may be culturally belong to having a lot of cultural assets, the education, attire, the language, different kind of access to the educational institution, cultural institution. So there may be other may be deprived of those cultural element, cultural capital we call it. There may be similarly political powerless and political powerful people. So there may be those kind of inconsistencies. So we find economic inconsistency, cultural inconsistency and the political inconsistency. Simultaneously, there is another, that is relative deprivation. That is, it is not absolute, relative. Some are culturally more progressed or some advanced, having more access over the cultural elements, some are less. Similarly, relative deprivation in the economic terms. Some are economically well off, relatively, some are economically less well off. Similarly, politically, some may be politically more powerful, some may be politically powerless. Then also there is cultural revitalization. At one point of time, it may come, that is, old culture gradually gets not rejected. People feel like there is an old culture, though needs a kind of a revitalization, a kind of a renewal in itself, so people may come to organize this social movement. Now this fourth phenomenon, what is important is that one is the reality. There may be in reality structural strain, there may be reality of status inconsistency, there may be realities of relative deprivation, or there may be a relative need of cultural revitalization. But what the social movement does, it creates a kind of subjective awareness about structural strain. It creates a subjective awareness for the status inconsistency, relative deprivation, and that motivates the people for a objective action. So social movement, because of it, that capacity of mobilization, it take note of those objective situation, and to out of this objective situation it creates a subjective force to promote certain change and transformation of the society through collective mobilization, through leadership, ideology and organization. Now, when you have talked all this about, let us talk about how social movements are also perceived by several school of thoughts across the globe. Social movement in the social science literature is a very new penetration, even though it is 100 years old. In the social science literature, 100 years is quite a limited time. We have to accept that though the age of civilization and the age of social science is quite new, but the social movement has existed in this earth till the existence of humanity. But this has been conceptualized starting from late 1920s differently by different scholars. One group of scholars, though they have not studied it, but they have isolated it, the social movement from the academic discipline because of certain phenomenon. They realize those can't be incorporated in the social science literature. The collective behavior perspective, they thought about social movement usually talk about non-institutionalized collective action, because all of a sudden people will come, they will ask for certain institutional changes, they will bring a kind of a breakdown either in the social organization or in the social control mechanism or in the normative arrangement of the society. So the collective behavior group, they thought of social movement are the non-institutionalized behavioral pattern. So they are kind of aberration in the society. Similarly, in the same vein, the widely came out the functionalist theorist. The functionalist theorist talks social movement that they are the potential agency of social disruption. What the functionalist talked about, that there is a social cohesion, social integration through the part, system and subsistence, parts and the total and the parts, the system and the subsistence. So through this cohesion and integration, a system function. When there is a social movement, there is a disruption in the societal arrangement. So social movement does not have a legitimate arena to exist within the social science literature. But it was for the first time the symbolic interactionists, they thought about the social movement, talk about something new in the society. They talk about a change in the society. By bringing it, they show the sign of new life that may arrive. The earth is a living being, society is a living being, so there is a new thought and action, there is a need of new societal framework. So social movement brings a new societal framework. So they accept that social movement to be a living being, a creative being in the society, the worth academic studies. The Marxist scholar, they consider social movement worth studying, but they are widely guided by economic determinism. They talked about all kind of social movement are the manifestation of class movement, the class of economic haves and have-nots, the owners and the non-owners, the employer and the employees. They try to see social movement in terms of dichotomies and binaries founded on economic determinism. So try to also, in that way, they limited the whole space of social movement articulation and social movement understanding in the society. Starting from late 1930s onward, the social movement became one of the vital area of social science engagement, both in America, North America, and also we find in the Western Europe. The North American perspective, they found that social movement having a legitimate space, it has emerged out of certain action and out of certain phenomenon that is created with the state intervention, with the people's engagement and some inherent instinct of human being themselves. They talked about the social movements are usually guided by the persuasion of common interest by the people. People usually look into their action in terms of certain rationality of cost and benefit. When people participate in the social movement, for them, because they calculate if they participate, they will get certain benefit. So cost and benefit calculation made the people an active agent in the participation in the social movement. But how the social movement culture created? They told social movement emerged because it is the welfare state that provided the space for political participation of the people. So by giving the political participation opportunities, it created that space for people's participation. So they also recognize it is the democratic culture of the welfare state that accommodated the collective initiative and collective mobilization. So they find this a kind of a linear kind of a relationship between popular protest, people desire to participate in terms of acquiring certain common interest, that opportunities they got within the political formation of the welfare state and the democratic culture of the society. By saying so, they talked about the social movement take place because of mobilization of varieties of those resources. Those resources they talked about, that human resources, the financial resources. So political power is achieved by mobilizing certain resources, and these are done when the rich people and those the moneyed people, the industrialists, they pump certain money on the people, on mobilization, so that there is a political mobilization by the political entrepreneurs to achieve certain political goal through political means. They looked into in terms of ends and means, in terms of articulation of interest in the society. When there is articulation of interest, they one step further. Tarot and other widely talked about the social movement are part of social framing and contentious politics. What is that contentious politics they talked about? A group of entrepreneurs, they name a kind of a social problem, simultaneously organize the people around that social problem, and they construct a world. Here is an world, a new imaginary world that is full of justice, and that can be acquired through people's participation. By doing it, they construct a kind of social image, and they make all the issues to be contentious issues. Through this contentious issues construction and framing, they frame a new kind of a world, and this new kind of a world, an imaginary world within which varieties of the people participate in the collective mobilization. So what they talked about, that is, in the process of that collective mobilization, so people construct a new world image. So in the process of new construction, social movements also contribute to the cognitive liberation. What is the cognitive liberation? That is a kind of new thought and action. So in the process of bringing new thought of action, it creates a new world. So what we find that they widely talk about, this is a North American perspective of resource mobilization, thought of social movement widely in terms of economic calculation, cost and benefit, pumping of money, and also resource mobilization to gain certain political benefit. But ultimately, those construction of a new world also contributes to the cognitive liberation, thinking of a new world. At this stage, let us talk about how the cognitive liberation and the new world is widely thought about by the new social movement or the identity perspective. While those kind of thoughts are going on in the North America, similar way social movements are articulated in the Western Europe, especially in the UK and in France. They talked about social movement like the labor movement that took place within the wide framework of emergence of the Fabian socialism in Europe, then idea of Fabian socialism, a socialism that is founded on democratic politics and also the welfare state in the UK and other countries. And they give wide space for people's participation in the making petition, making protest, and expressing their feeling about nationalism to the state. So those expression of those interest, expression of those feeling widely contributed to the articulation of new kind of issues they came. That issues came not only in terms of the labor movement, it also widely came in terms of the black movement, the gender equality movement, the human rights, the environmental movement, the grey rights movements. So new kind of articulation started coming in. So what they started doing it within the whole process of Fabian socialism and welfare state, people started cognizing. It is not a cognition, it is recognition of identity. Through the recognition of identity and self, they tried to create a new kind of a world environment. In this new kind of world environment, what they started talking about, that is what Alain Touraine already talked about, that is new social movement emerged to provide, to get a potential. It emerged as the potential bearer of a new social interest. It is not the old social economic interest, it is a new social interest. That new social interest was widely guided by subjectivity, idealism, emotion, and those subjectivity, idealism and emotion is not founded on materialism. This is widely founded on a wider concern for the people to empower themselves following a means of non-violence, following a kind of autonomy. That is that autonomy speaking in two spheres. One sphere of autonomy is that one people having the autonomy to be part of varieties of social movement in one point of time. They may be they have the autonomy to participate in the labor movement, participate in the black civil rights movement, animal rights movement, gay rights movement. So they are having that autonomy. Simultaneously, that is the personal autonomy. That is, they can enjoy that personal autonomy from that public autonomy. So a kind of a liberation started coming in, and that liberation was totally founded, until now totally founded, the whole idea of global concern guided by subjectivity, idealism, emotion, and a sense to empower the people, guided or autonomy. What we find at this stage, that is, so far we have discussed, that is the North American perspectives of resource mobilization, a powerful perspective. Similarly, another powerful perspective of this new identity perspective, or a new social movement perspective. The new social movement perspective tried to see the world not in terms of chronology of the old, chronology of the new, in terms of the new ideas, as I told earlier. Now, this arrival of these two kind of phenomenon, the existence of two kind of phenomenon, resource mobilization guided by interest, and the new identity perspective guided by the identity. So we find a two kind of perspective, interest and the identity, the subjectivity, idealism getting a more reflection. Now, how it is located in the globalized world, and how the globalized world contributing to the manifestation of a new kind of social movement. Now, when we talk about globalization, as I told in my first introductory part, globalization is having certain co-constituent of this new liberal economic globalization that we experienced from the late 1980s. It is guided by three important co-constituents. One is that enormous proliferation of information communication technologies, that is computer, the laptop, mobile phone, or several kind of apps, the email, WhatsApp, Facebook, that exchanges varieties of information at a faster speed, and that has produced a new kind of a social age, what you call the information age, and knowledge-based society. That has changed the human mind, human's creativity from land and industry to that of human mind. By doing it, it has widely facilitated a fast flow of several characters of societies, the fast flow of human being from one part of the globe to another part, fast flow of information with the click of mouse or tips of finger, from one part of the globe to another. Similarly, fast flow of money, images, risk, practices and emotion across the globe. By doing it, we find that it has created new kind of a world which is identity is not guided based on a physical proximity, rather at time it is a kind of a cyber proximity. So we kind of a fluid kind of identity, there is a fuzzy kind of identities in the society, it has emerged, and within that a social movement is taking place across the space based on the one hand a kind of a new emotion, new kind of a social aspiration, on the other hand fuzziness of the identities. Now when you talk about this world, globalized world, in terms of fuzziness of the identity, fast flow of goods and services, we find that what has happened, a new forces across the globe, it has decontextualized the world. In the process of decontextualization, it has brought in several contradictions in the relationship in the society. What are those contradictions? We find that in the process of decontextualization, a kind of contradiction between the interest and identities. So it is not quite easy to look into whether some solidarities are formed for the sake of identities or for the sake of interest. There is also interface and a kind of a complexity between these two. Can we compartmentalize the social grouping following in terms of economic interest or something guiding in the name of only identities? Let us give an example. When you talk about the nationality's identity, it is above all identities. People are guided by certain emotion and identities. Interest, economic interest, interest of the agricultural laborer, interest of the workers, interest of the farmers, those are the economic interest. So what we find, what are the intersectionalities and contradiction between, on the one hand, identity, those who are guided by an amount of subjective element and meaning, on the one hand, a realities of economic interest. Similarly, it is guided a contradiction between the subjectivity and objectivity, whether it is a subjective feeling that is guiding my behavior or a behavior of a group, or it is the objective social phenomenon that is conditioning a group to behave particular behavior. Similarly, a contradiction between the morality and rationality, whether it is a moral commitment or it is a rational action, a kind of contradiction in that space. Similarly, we find there is enormous process of getting solidarity based on certain group. On the other hand, we find a lot of fluidity within that group. Take an example, we kind of a solidarity of our nation at one point of time. Those solidarities coming in the name of one nation or one identity. Then we find those identities get a kind of a fluidity within that identity when the country and the people get divided in terms of caste, ethnicity, religion. So we find again that contradiction at time get reflected, rationality at times reflected in terms of morality. We also find similarly the process of framing and cognition, singularity of identity, plurality of identity. Then we find another kind of a social versus social anti or anti-social. What we find within this whole process, when we talk about identity, whether identity is a liability or identity is an asset. Identity is a liability in the context of proliferation of social movement, or identity becomes just otherwise. So what is important that we are living in a globalized world that has brought a lot of contradiction within this social movement phenomenon. Within this contradiction, now we find different kind of social movement is taking place across the globe. What is that? A kind of a multiple varieties of social movement across the globe. What are those social movement? We find the nationality movement. We find the religious movement, we find the environmental movement, the gay rights movement, environmental protection movement. So we find the varieties of those movement. They want to create an image of another world, image of a new world, and through that they try to construct at time lot of cultural identities, the economic identities and political identities. So we find this globalized world is guided by proliferation of varieties of social movement taking place across the world. Take India as an example. We find it is a site of manifestation of varieties of social movement. The peasant movement, the farmers movement, the Dalits movement, the tribal movement, women's movement, the environmental movement. What you find, those movement has made the people resilient, conscious about their own kind of problems, issues and identities in this society. Simultaneously, none of these movements are isolated. They are linked and interlinked with one another in terms of certain common point, in terms of certain dots. By doing it, those interlinkages, it is creating a culture of a social movement society. A social movement society that is widely guided by plurality of social movement, taking up long-term and permanent position in the society on diverse issues and interest. So it is not a one-time, it's a long-term interest and multiplicity of the social movement. That's why we find wider linkages between the Dalit and the indigenous people's movement. Dalit and indigenous movement, people's movement with environmental movement. The interlinkages of the Dalit and the indigenous people's movement with the agricultural workers movement, the industrial workers movement. So we find a kind of interlinkages that is creating a culture of collective assertion in a plural framework within the society. When this is taking place, on the one hand, what Vavirika widely talking about, there is the proliferation of new kind of assertion in diverse processes, creating the democratic space within the available democratic space and also creating the democratic space. Two issues quite important. Number one is that there is the availability of the democratic space within which multiplicity of the social movement is taking place. On the other hand, those social movements are also creating the democratic space with the citizenship rights for their collective assertion. So these two taking place on the one hand. So this is talking about the creation of a democratic space in terms of a plurality of the culture. But within the same context, with the proliferation of multiplicity of the social movement, fast flow of goods, services and images, what do you find? A kind of a manifestation of a different kind of a social movement culture, what you call inverted image of social movement, that is widely social anti-movement. That social anti-movement, they are squeezing the space, at times destroying the space that is created by social movement culture. This social anti-movement, they are talking about not of the citizenship right, they are talking about the absolute rights. They are talking about the homogeneity as against the heterogeneity. They are talking about the purity of the culture rather than morality of the culture. They champion the absolute and they adopt an attitude of the do and die. So what is important, and these movements, this social anti-movement also become violent by not creating that space of democratic space. It takes the violent form. But the new social movement created the space of non-violent collective assertion in a sustainable manner. That social anti-movement create the space of violent social expression by promoting absolute and championing the absolutes and taking a do and die attitude, and they create a new kind of a culture by destroying the pre-existing democratic framework of the society. So what Vavirika widely talks about, they appear in an arena where social movement also exists. But what they do, they try to destroy the social movement which is existing in the contemporary world. They fight against the social movement culture. So that is what we talked about, the globalization, white on the one hand, given the space of proliferation of multiple social movement, creating a space for social movement culture, it's also creating the space for social anti-movement. At this stage, let us go to the last part of our discussion, what we call it, transformation of the social movement. Initially, I talked about every social movement is having a life history. Having a life history, it undergo a process of transformation. In the process of transformation, we find various vital elements of the social movement undergo changes. Its leadership undergo changes, its leadership, organization, its sustainability, its culture of protest, everything undergo changes. In the process of changes, it acquires different kind of formulation. It may be transformed. it may be transformed, a revolutionary movement that is affecting wide range of social and far-reaching changes. Any revolutionary movement that widely talk of far-reaching wider changes in the society, it may be transformed in the quasi-movement in the society. That is, they look for only limited area of change in the society. So there is that the process of transformation from revolutionary movement to the quasi-movement. The another important transformation may take place, what we call it, from radical movement to transformative movement. A radical movement, they resolve for a large-scale collective mobilization and try to bring about radical changes through radical ideology. They want to bring a change in the structural arrangement of the society. While they may be transformed into a reformative movement, they look for changes in the institutional arrangement of the society, some of the social processes. So that may also take place in terms of revolutionary to quasi-movement, radical to reformative movement. Even there is a possibility that old social movement, those are the class-based movement, they may also get transformed into a new social movement, creating a new social identities, having the new social concern. But what we are talking about, it is not necessarily that revolutionary will be a quasi, radical will be reformative, old will be new. It may be the vice versa. A new social movement may take the character of a old social movement, or a reformative movement over a period of time may take the form of a radical movement, or a quasi movement take the form of a revolutionary movement. So what we find, there is enormous complementarity between the institutionalized and the radical movement within the whole process of articulation of interest, whole journey, new developmental trajectory of social movement. What do you find? Then when there is a process of mobilization, there is a mobilization, it creates the possibility of varieties of other mobilization in the society. By doing it, we find the process of collective mobilization and institutionalization go hand in hand. So Indian society is widely reflected with varieties of evidences that many of the revolutionary movement, they have taken the form of institutionalized character, and many of the institutionalized movement has remained as an institutionalized movement. At this point, many of the scholars widely contribute to the fact that when a social movement gets transformed into a political party, it ceases to be a social movement, because the oppositional zeal, the zeal for collective mobilization that remains attached to a social movement, that zeal gradually get dejected, gradually get aborted from the social movement culture. So what you find in the whole trajectory of a social movement, there is a process of complementarity between collective mobilization and institutionalization. Okay. Now at this stage, let us have a kind of a recap what we discussed. First, we discussed, that is, the location of social movement within the wider social processes, number one. Then we talked about what are the vital elements of social movement. That is, we have talked about the 10 important elements of social movement: the ideology, the organization, leadership, collective mobilization, interest articulation, sustainability. These are the vital elements of social movement. Then we talked about various perspectives of social movement studies: the North American perspective, the West European perspective, the resource mobilization perspective, the new social movement perspective. Then we talked about how this proliferation of social movement has taken place within the with the arrival of a globalizing era. How social movement is constructing varieties of fluidity and contradiction in this society. Within that, we find there has been proliferation of social movement on the one hand and social anti-movement on the other. Then we talked about the whole dynamics of change and transformation in the social movement. Then we talked about how the radical social movement getting institutionalized, the revolutionary social movement taking the form of quasi-movement, or the old social movement taking the form of new social movement. Then we finally talked about complementarity between the institutionalized mobilization and the possibility of future mobilization for social movement. Thank you for being with us, and we'll welcome your feedback, if any. Thank you.